Welcome all to the start of our Government In-House Council Week and our first live session with the Honourable Nick Greiner. Welcome, Nick.
Thanks, Ash.
My name's Ashley Sakalis, and Nick Greiner was the Premier of New South Wales and the Treasurer between 1988 and 1992. After leaving politics, he also had a stellar business career and was also the last Premier to govern during a recession. Today, we are keen to hear from Nick about how the pandemic could change the nature and role of government and the public sector. You'll have an opportunity to ask any questions throughout the 1 hour session, and I'll direct those to Nick when you ask them. Nick, just to start off, just wanted to ask you, what do you think is the impact of COVID-19 on public policy and reform?
I think, Ashley, it is a bit like impact of COVID on everything, because it's completely unprecedented, because there isn't a background of modelling, either in health modelling or in economic modelling. It's radical uncertainty, as Lord King, the British economist and Governor of the Bank of England, said. It's radical uncertainty. So as a result, I think the impact on the public sector and public policy is that for the first time in, well, really ever, we've got a climate, a context where people can't predict with any certainty what's going to happen. It provides both problems, because you can't do it the way it's always been done, and opportunities, because you can't do it the way it's always been done. And frankly, I think it gives management, whether it's public sector, private sector, political, whatever, it gives them some cover. It gives them a framework, a burning platform. So I think burning platform is really what it provides for the public service, and different views will come as to whether that's good or bad.
And in terms of how that affects the public service, so just reflecting on your time as Premier and Treasurer, the late 80s, early 90s, and then how the public service has evolved in that time, both also pre and post COVID-19. What's your thoughts on the role of the public service over that period?
Well, look, the public service to those outside it has, of course, always been regarded as erring on the side of conservatism, on the side of being risk averse. Now, I think many people in the public service, and indeed some of the political class there, if you like, political masters, think that's a perfectly appropriate thing for the public service to have. But I think over the 30 years since I was in government, I think people generally think there's been a bit of a freeze on reform. There's been almost a lack of desire. The public, perhaps, really don't like change all that much. As a result, if the public don't like change, a lot of politicians don't like change, and it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So I think overall in the 30 years, there's been less emphasis on reform. And you can see that around the world. It isn't just an Australian phenomenon, but it certainly is true in Australia. But I think observers would say that overall there's been less reform, less change, and an emphasis on process, on probity, on compliance. There's a whole new area of the law and management which deals with compliance. So I think it's gone that way. I would say too far that way. And I think the opportunity that COVID, in terms of the earlier question, provides is that if people in positions to make effective decisions, whether they're politicians or senior public servants, they can use the reality of the uncertainty in COVID to actually accelerate the pace of change if they think that's desirable.
And in terms of the role of lawyers in-house within the public service, reflecting on that same period of time, how have you observed lawyers, general counsel, in-house lawyers evolve over that time, both in the public service and also reflecting on your private sector career?
Well, I've had more experience, really only experience in the last 28 going on 30 years in the private sector. It's certainly true there that general counsel, the senior lawyers and those around them have become a core part of management, of general management, if you like. So in many public companies, many large overseas companies that I've been a director of, the senior legal person is, in a sense, the right-hand man or woman of the CEO. And so it's a role that is broader than what you might call a narrow or technical legal role. It's how do you get things done? How does the chief executive or the board achieve a purpose or a change? I think there is a view, maybe my prejudice, and perhaps people listening will have a different view. I think there is a view that the legal profession, especially in government, tends to specialise in avoiding risk, in ensuring compliance. It doesn't tend to have the same emphasis on how do we help get something done. It's more how do we stop something not so good happening. And I think that's a fairly important distinction.
And just expanding on that issue specifically, obviously the COVID-19 pandemic has resulted in government having to react quite quickly to the emerging and evolving health and economic crisis that we face. And therefore, government doesn't have the opportunity to formulate its policies over a longer period of time, as it likes to do ordinarily, and stress test some of those policies. So to what extent do the lawyers in-house need to be aware of, I guess, that emerging issue, but also the unintended consequences of those really, really quick policy decisions that are being made and implemented?
Well, I think, and look, I used to work for Clayton Utz before most people on the call were born, but I'm the only one to work here at board level without being a lawyer, so I need to confess to that. but having said that, I think that that lawyers have an opportunity to be part of the risk management, part of the scenario management, and the sorts of changes you're referring to, I think are going to move risk management from being a sort of fairly pedantic thing where you've got a risk register and you rate all the risks from high to medium to low, and that's all useful enough. It tends to be a bit of a do it by rote exercise in practice. I think there is a real role for lawyers to see themselves and hopefully have their colleagues and their superiors see them as an integral part of the management function in a period of uncertainty, in a period when you are quite unsure about what might be the consequences of an action. So I do think there's an opportunity for the legal profession, public or private sector, to really see itself as part of responding to the new normal, as people like to say.
And I wanted to take you to a recent review of the Australian Public Service. So you might recall that former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull commissioned a review of the Australian Public Service in May 2018, headed by David Thodey, who was the chair, and it reported back in September last year. And it was the biggest review of the Australian Public Service since the Coombs Royal Commission in 1976. There were some useful themes that emerged from that review that have applicability to the New South Wales Public Service and any public service, no doubt. These themes were the result of an engagement with over 11,000 stakeholders, 400 consultations and many surveys, etc. I wanted to take you to some of these themes and just get your response to them, if I could, Nick. So the first theme that emerged, and this is in that APS review, was that the public service lacks a clear, unified purpose. There are 170 plus purpose statements that reinforce agency, not whole of government priorities.
Most of these things you're going to take me to are, I think, in the area of bleeding obvious, but they also are in the area of very important to address. I think most of these, including this one, which you might categorise as whole of government. Look, I found when I was Premier 30-odd years ago, I found since in working for government, both state and federal, in terms of doing various consulting jobs, the hardest thing to do is to have an effective whole of government or even whole of governments, federal, state, local, approach. And I think there is the greatest capacity for improvement, and you'll no doubt take me back to COVID at some stage. I think we've demonstrated that a bit in this situation. So I really do think that in this case, mostly general counsel or sort of people on the call, they ought to read that report, or at least the executive summary, because it isn't something that's out over there. I think it is something to which the legal profession has a real opportunity to contribute. So, yeah, I think the absence of a whole of government or whole of government's approach is one of the greatest weaknesses in the way we govern ourselves.
And the next theme is that the public service is too internally focused, and it cites the fact that only 3 in 10 Australians trust government services.
Yeah, look, I think that's a different sort of issue, isn't it? I'm sure that sort of poll is right. I don't think that would surprise anyone listening to us, but it is more a perception. If you look at the New South Wales government, I think this present government since 2011 has done a fantastic job in that broad services New South Wales area, which I'm sure produces better public perception. Certainly people like me, when they go and get their licence renewed, think, wow, it's a whole new experience. So nevertheless, I think changing that perception, the 3 out of 10 who think they sort of trust government services, it obviously shows you the improvement in perception that's available for governments and public servants.
And I should say that is very consistent with international research. It's not just peculiar, I found, to Australian governments at all.
In fact, most of what we're talking about isn't a peculiar Australian phenomenon, except perhaps at some stage if we get to the Federation, obviously we have an additional level of government and the division between federal, state and local is different here in many other countries. But no, these are universal problems that reflect society, technology, all the changes that are happening to all of us.
Yes, and we will, I promise, get to Commonwealth-state relations. It's an area of great interest, I know, of yours and mine. The next theme is, and it's related to what you've talked about, is the underinvestment in digital services. There's a suggestion that a lot of the work goes into running old systems rather than building and transforming those systems.
Look, I think, again, so most of the findings of David Thodey and his panel, which I thought were pretty good, but frankly, none of them would have been a terrible shock to anyone who's been in and around the senior levels, in that case of the APS, but I don't think the state public services are dramatically different. So I think that is, perhaps almost self-evidently the situation.
The next one was fails to strategically manage and invest in its most valuable asset, its people, with 28% of senior external recruits leaving within 2 years.
Look, I used to, after I left government, I went into lots of public company boards, and people would ask me to come and make speeches about the difference between public and private sector. And one of the differences I always used to point to was that in the private sector, let's call it big public companies, big international companies, the importance of the human relations function, the importance of recruitment, of talent development, the importance of succession planning, that broad area of HR, if you want to call it that, remains much more important in the private sector than the public sector. And I think that is a bad thing, because many of the sort of structural problems, issues, the problems of making it very hard to change anything in the public sector are, I think, a reflection of this. So, yeah, look, I couldn't agree more. I think in terms of your previous question about technology and this one, you can now see in governments that there are more and more senior chief technology officers and data analytics think tanks, as there is in the New South Wales government. And in HR, there's less of that. There is still pretty much a silo, pretty much people tend to work in departments. People don't, or they work in functional areas like all the lawyers part of this call. Whereas in the private sector, there is a real emphasis on providing opportunity for people to change and to develop. So I think HR is along with technology, they're the two sort of areas of the future as far as the public service is concerned.
And I want to come back to both of those separately as well, if I could, Nick. The other one was, and you've touched on it as well, that the public service, and this is one of the themes to emerge from the APS review, typically operate in silos, rigid hierarchies and traditional ways of working, and they lack a united leadership team. Were two of the other themes to emerge, and I think you've touched on both of those.
Yeah. Well, I tried because I came from a business background when I went into politics, and I think I was the first person to really push the notion of a board of secretaries. I think they call it federally. I don't know what they call it in New South Wales, but there is a similar entity, and there are also boards of deputy secretaries, because I've spoken to that group in New South Wales. But yeah, look, silos are a problem everywhere. It's partly human nature. We wake up and we don't sort of think we work for the New South Wales government. We wake up and think we work for the planning department or IPART or whatever it might be. And there isn't a real push from above that says good performance depends on making the walls of the silos more porous, or indeed maybe putting them together. You can see the politicians trying with various mergers, and you can see Gladys has been trying in New South Wales in terms of structure. I have a notion it's more than structure, actually. I think it's in the mind, and it's in the public interest rather than in the narrow interest of the particular department and its clients, which may not tally with the public interest.
And the last thing to emerge is that the public service is not changing fast enough to deliver for Australians in a changing world. Now, ironically, this may not be as true these days as it was only, less than a year ago.
Sure. Yeah, look, I think, as you suggest, the answer to that is obvious, and it's obvious right across the board. I mean, you look at the way the football codes are having to manage themselves. You look at the way companies are managing themselves. To some extent, it is simply companies doing things that they've always wanted to do but didn't have the courage or the wherewithal to do it. There isn't. I think it'd be fictitious to pretend that there isn't an element of, call it management, using the opportunity and never waste a good crisis. I notice a lot of people have been claiming that. It goes back to Churchill and a bloke called Rahm Emanuel, who was Obama's chief of staff, and there are various other people who claim never waste a good crisis. But nevertheless, there are obviously organisations, public and private, who are speeding things up, are doing new things. And look, that's a reflection. Society's changing faster. So it isn't just, it's not just COVID, and it's not the public service only. It is generally that society is changing. Our children, their generation, are used to a much higher pace of change and a much greater use of technology than the two generations between the children and me. So yeah, this is speed. Speed is something that hasn't usually been a high up on the list of public sector characteristics. And I think as the society changes and the problems change more quickly, it's more and more important.
And that's where I wanted to pivot into the future of the public sector as well. So what you're describing is, I guess, the importance of being nimble and agile as the public service. And you've touched on this already as well, but can you see over time the traditional structures around departments and agencies breaking down, and perhaps employees being organised around working groups, task forces more so?
Yeah, look, I think based on is hope and expectation, I would hope the answer is yes. The expectation, based on having been around government since 1980 when I was elected to state parliament, there is a lot of inertia in the public service. That's where the sort of word bureaucracy comes from. It connotes a resistance and a capacity to resist some of the things we've been talking about. And there's no doubt bureaucracies are better at resisting change than they are at implementing change. And so I think there will be change. I mean, there is already, but I suspect it'll be, except, for example, in areas like the National Cabinet where there are some opportunities coming out of their sort of burning platform, I suspect the rate of change in the public service will be slower rather than faster, but it'll still be a lot faster than it's been historically.
And one suggestion that I've seen is that governments should apply almost a consulting staff model to their workforces in the future to allow members of the public service to move from project to project. Do you believe that this may influence the public service workforce of the future?
Well, look, I think central agencies, from my time to now, the central agencies have accumulated more power to themselves. If you look at Premier's Department, Prime Minister's Department, there's now a Deputy Secretary in New South Wales in charge of delivery, not implementation. And that's, again, a deliverology. The McKinseys of the world write papers on how you can make better use of the public service. And to some extent, there is no doubt that that sort of, you could call it a consulting model, or you could call it a central agency oversight, more intimate central agency oversight of the particular functional departments, the education, health, environment, Attorney General, or whatever. So I think there is likely to be a continued emphasis on getting things done. If I can tell you a short story, I know I've only got a short time, but I discovered that the phrase "the Premier said" was amazingly widely used in my government, not because I said lots of things, although I probably did, but because people found it an effective device. People from in the Premier's Department and the Treasury, both of which I was responsible for, tended to use that. Now, I think there is a concern, which I certainly share, that the problem is not working out what is good policy. There might be differences, but by and large, people know what's good policy. The problem is actually getting things done. And I think that's where General Counsel and legal officers can actually help. The problem in the public sector is not working out the answer. The problem is working out how to implement and execute the answer once you've got there. And I think that's a key distinction, and it's where some of those organisational changes come from, because there's frustration by Premier, often heads of government, about the capacity to execute rather than the capacity to really come up with the policy.
And that neatly ties into my next question. There's some research and literature that says government should be an enabler rather than a solution provider. And do you agree? And to what extent can the public service assist in this regard?
I don't. I'm not sure the distinction is all that useful. I do think the government depends on both solutions and on enablement of those solutions. I think what tends to happen is that governments are not good at, and politicians are not good at, execution. Politicians think, they've made the headline decision, we will have this closed or we will do whatever. They make the headline decision. And I've got to say, I certainly suffered from this. You tend to think once Cabinet's decided that that's the direction, you kid yourself, but that's actually what happens. I've got to say, in the private sector, in very big public companies I've been on the board of, Coles Myer and QBE and whatever, once you get to that stage, the policy is in fact executed. I think in the public sector, not just because of the bureaucracy, but because most decisions are open to a lot of stakeholders. So there's a lot of people who would like to influence against a change. So I think it's that area of actually implementing, call it cabinet, call it government decisions, is massively important. And it's not an area in which there's been huge progress. There's been lots of talk, theory, but and indeed some structural, the British government's had a lot of structural experiments in this area. I don't think anyone's made a huge amount of progress. It'd be a lot better I noticed a lot of people from the planning department on the call. Clearly be a lot better if the planning department was seen to implement government policy more effectively, if you like, than having someone second guess it. What tends to happen in that area and in most areas is that governments think, oh, well, we're not going to get change out of the core department, so we'll start up a separate panel, a separate oversight in the Premier's office or the Treasurer's office or whatever. And that's a reaction to frustration about getting things done.
And you've touched on this already as well, but certainly over the last couple of decades, there's been a shift to more personalised and customised services, and that applies to government. You've already mentioned Service New South Wales and how that's delivered to that extent, and also New South Wales last year, the Premier introduced the Department of Customer Service, which was quite a novel department. I know the EU is currently doing some work around citizen-centric whole of government models and the like. To what extent do you think we are moving increasingly to a citizen-centric model or approach to public policy, and the structure of the public service will need to respond accordingly?
Well, I think we are moving that way, and we're moving quite quickly that way. It's not always as successful as we might like, but certainly in the areas where the public are the clients, it's happening. I think you'll find a lot of the people on the call work in areas where, in a sense, the public are not the direct recipients of the service, if you like. So I think you need to try and apply that same sort of citizen-centric and customer-centric, where that's more appropriate, to everything that happens, not just to, certainly if you go down to Transport House, they got a lot of stuff about customers, and I think there is actually quite good evidence that transport is getting much better at meeting customer views. And the technology, the data, the use of data helps that a lot. So yeah, I think that's here to stay. I suspect some people in the public service hear that and they think, oh, it's BS. It doesn't apply to me. It might apply to getting your license renewed. I think it actually applies pretty much universally. You've got to make sure that the nuances are applied. It obviously isn't the same everywhere, but I do think the citizen-centric trend is going to be ubiquitous as far as the future of the public service.
And you mentioned data, Nick, and information and so forth, and how government can use data and various information that it collects for the purposes of rolling out various policies, programs, projects, etc. And of course, it needs to have appropriate safeguards in place. To what extent do you see that increasing use and reliance on data and information, and how might this affect the composition of the public service going forward in terms of perhaps more data analysts, predictive modelling taking place and so forth?
Well, I think you can see that already happening, but I think there's also some resistance to that. A few years ago, I did a review, or I chaired a review about regulation for Mike Baird. And one of the things we found, not surprisingly, that what you've just said is true, that the sophisticated use of data to help with regulation, which regulations are needed, not needed, are there alternatives to regulation? I think it's fair to say we found a reasonable amount of resistance to that, and there are a lot of convenient things that help. Privacy is the usual one. So, I would say to our listeners on this call, the normal response we get from lawyers is, well, you can't do that because, and there's this privacy consideration. That's a really good area where I think lawyers need to work intimately with the data analytics, those wanting to gather and utilise the data. And you need to find ways, and sure, there are some legitimate privacy concerns, of course there are. But, I said earlier in our chat, I think if lawyers see themselves as having the task of how do we enable data to be used in a way that meets legitimate privacy concerns, but also enables the benefits of data analysis to be realised. I have a notion that by and large, in a sweeping generalisation, lawyers tend to be a bit on the conservative side. Well, you can't do that because of this. And I think the desirable change in direction a bit is, well, you can do this, but only if you solve this and that
X, Y, and Z, yes. And you touched on your productivity review, regulatory policy review rather, and I just wanted to talk about that for a moment. So that was almost 3 years ago. You were the chair of a panel that undertook an independent review of the New South Wales regulatory policy framework. And I just quote this sentence, which I think is very useful to start this conversation. In your report, you stated that the regulatory policy framework is the backbone of the public sector and a critical determinant of how the government delivers its services effectively. What role do you think the regulatory policy framework should play, and how can it be adapted to present circumstances?
Well, I think we found, and indeed other reviews elsewhere have found, that regulation tends to be dominated, and again, it's a generalisation, doesn't apply everywhere. Regulation tends to be dominated by the in crowd. It tends to be dominated by the department and the public servants. It often tends to be dominated by those parts of the private sector who have a vested interest in the maintenance of an existing regulatory structure. And we found broadly that in New South Wales, and it applies federally as well, and there's a similar review there, that there wasn't really a champion for the public interest. In terms of your earlier point about citizen-centric, there wasn't really a champion for the public interest, whether the issue was regulation of chemicals that get used in production of fruit or vegetables or whatever, from things like that right through to various safety considerations, right across the huge range of stuff for which there's regulation. We found that in the government's process of making regulation, there ought to be a champion, as the government eventually called it the Productivity Commission, which was a champion for what is this regulation's impact on the public, what alternatives to new or tougher regulation have been looked at. So has the process been appropriate if the target is to achieve the best result for the broad interest rather than for the narrow interest of a particular company or a particular area of government, whatever it might be. So, look, I think and politicians, let me say, given that's my background, are certainly not without blame in this. If, people die in a certain sort of vehicle, the natural instinct is to be seen to be doing something. So if you ban whatever sort of vehicle it is, you've done something. There's often no evidence that that is the best answer overall, but it certainly serves the political interest that you've been seen to be doing something, so that hopefully there won't be the second person who dies in a similar accident. So it's not an easy area, and it's of course not a sexy area, but it's an important area, and I think all the governments are trying very hard to come up with a regulatory process that isn't tick a box, which is what we found a lot of the regulation review was, but actually make sure that not just the argument for, but the argument against a particular regulation and the description of how an outcome was achieved are really very clear. And I think there remains lots of work to be done around the world in making regulations fit for purpose rather than fit for a more narrow defensive purpose for a politician.
And you mentioned one of the key reforms that or recommendations was Productivity Commission in essence, which has emerged. Do you think that this area needs to attract greater attention in the current climate, and some of these regulatory reforms need to be fast-tracked to aid economic recovery as well?
Yeah, well, hopefully. I think there is a willingness. One of the things we found, which it's a good question, Ashley, we found, not surprisingly, that there was much overlap, and that the person wanting to start a small business generally had to tell governments once, twice, three times, sometimes had to tell local government as well. So we had a bunch of recommendations, not all of which I remember, but they were things like tell them once. In other words, if you want to open a coffee shop in the city, you should have to tell people once, not tell the state or even different state departments, plus the Commonwealth, plus the Sydney City Council, if that's the example. So we generally found, and that's a worthwhile challenge to the audience, we found that the willingness to acknowledge the benefits of, call it one-stop shopping, of reducing overlap and all of those sorts of things, by and large, people wanted to justify the status quo, which is not surprising. It was the area in which they work. But we certainly found, and it applies at all levels of government, there is a resistance to getting rid of duplication. There is and you can see it a bit in the present COVID thing, arguments about what do different parts of government do. The lack of clarity is certainly a lack of clear boundaries, clear fences, if you like, is, I think, a major problem. And the lack of a process for resolving those differences, which has been reasonably good in the National Cabinet on COVID. But generally speaking, we found that it was not highly valued by the existing regulators. And so that's why you need something like a productivity commission or other sort of probably central agency type things to push back against the narrow regulatory response.
Even the extent, I know Minister Dominello has introduced an Australian death notification form, because essentially on the death of a loved one, relative, etc., you have to notify so many different government agencies, but also banks and other providers and so forth. And he's eliminating a number of those unnecessary notifications now, because you can do it in a one-stop shop, and that will help a number of people who are obviously grieving at the same time, and then having to...
That's a good example. But I mean, if the public service simply accepted that tell them once, and that tell them once could be the private sector as well, and there are lots of circumstances, if you could, and the technology does enable you now to make it really very easy both to gather it in one place and then distribute it to whoever needs it. So, we certainly were very strong on that. I think the government accepted it, but I'd have to be honest, I'm not sure that there's been a massive improvement. I think there will be some pressure post-COVID. You can see it already in some of the project approval areas, environmental approval. When I was Premier, there were no EPAs. There are now EPAs at both, call it the Sydney-Canberra, if you like. And of course, there is a fairly large amount of actual and potential overlap. That really is something that one ought to be able to improve.
Yes. And during your time as Premier and Treasurer, you ushered in a number of accountability, transparency and integrity reforms, including the introduction of the FOI Act, since being replaced by the GIPA Act, ICAC and so forth. And I know this is an area that I was going to ask a question. We've got a question from the audience. In the aftermath of the government's response to COVID-19, do you anticipate that there may be increased need for further transparency, accountability and integrity measures?
I would hope, I would hope the answer is no. I mean, the measures, certainly in New South Wales, I happen to be in favour of a national integrity commission. I've said that. I think everyone now is, but they're sort of arguing about what does it really mean and so on. But I think they need to be applied. I mean, I gave evidence years ago at an inquiry into ICAC, which, of course, as you say, I set up. And you need to make these institutions work effectively for the purpose of which they were set up. There is no doubt that ICAC for a while in New South Wales, especially after it was involved in my demise, people used it, public service used it as a means of stopping things happening, saying, oh, we can't do that, we've got to get ICAC approval. And the idea is not to hamstring the approval processes, whatever they may be. So it is true. I mean, I remember getting into terrible trouble because I brought in what was then FOI. I think we were the first state to have freedom of information. And my colleagues were mostly not very enthusiastic about that, nor indeed were senior department heads and so on. But some of these things, the principle is obvious. Yes, they're not easy to implement down to the finest detail, but people do need to remember in governments and people running these integrity bodies, they're not an end in themselves. They have got a public policy purpose. I think there are now pretty much enough. I could even say there might be a superfluity of integrity agencies and a bit of a on the back foot. No one wants to take a risk. I think that's changing. It's certainly changing with ICAC in New South Wales, where there's been some reforms. So there will be a national integrity body. I don't think the answer is more and more, call it reform, unless the reform is how do you utilise things like technology to make it an easier process of revealing what might have gone on in a situation. But it doesn't serve an end in itself. It serves an important end in terms of public trust in institutions, which is not high. But I hope we've got enough bodies and we make them function better. I think that's the test.
And then just in terms of the audience question about that, should those integrity agencies, their role and remit change if traditional government structures change, as we've been talking about? They need to evolve with those government structures.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly true, I think, that as central agencies have developed more power, and they have, both in a political and an administrative sense. I mean, you saw it in Senator McKenzie and the stuff about sports frauds, and did she declare her whatever she got from the gun club where she was a $36 a year member. I think there is, so I do think it's important that the centre, and until recently I was working closely with the Prime Minister's office. I don't think any Prime Minister's office automatically wants more scrutiny. I think it is inevitable that as power is concentrated towards the centre, and as some of these whole of government things happen, which I hope they will, I think it is important that the ICACs of the world are comfortable in saying we're not just there to look at a narrow departmental, have the driver's licence guys been corrupt or not in how they give out licences, that sort of traditional corruption. I think the broader, more complex questions are important, and certainly agencies shouldn't shy away from them. In fact, I'd rather they concentrate on some of those more strategic and important things rather than on some of the more, is this politically appropriate or not for there to be a political oversight on who gets a grant. So it's making it work better, that I think is the key.
And another initiative you introduced as Premier and Treasurer was the introduction of the Independent Pricing and Regulatory Tribunal, or IPARD. Yeah. I was interested in what was the impetus and key drivers of the introduction of IPARD.
Yeah, well, I am proud of. I'm proud of ICAC in its own way as well, but I'm very proud of IPARD. I mean, there is now something like an IPARD in every state and something like an ICAC in every state. Look, the reason for doing it was to provide an arm's length independent assessment of economic policy, of productivity. There's a quote from a Juncker, who was the Prime Minister of Luxembourg, and then he became the head of the EU. And he said, look, the problem is we all know what to do. We don't know how to get re-elected after we've done it. The part was about getting me re-elected after we'd done some reforms, but it was we were looking at pricing. It's the second part. It's the second letter of IPART, and we wanted there to be an independent view as to what was in the public interest. Now, the political interest is always obvious. Keep prices low and keep them lower if you can, and keep them lower for people who've got less money and all of that. Perfectly obvious what the political imperatives are. The question is, what are the right pricing structures? Why, at the time, and it's still the case a bit, why do we don't charge enough for power at the peak? Because we spend huge amounts of money at the very 99th percentile of the energy production, and yet the prices are the same. And we would, things like that, trying to find rational solutions for pricing and indeed regulation to help us. I mean, I was keen on change, on reform. IPART was a vehicle to assist in that process on making it a non-political, more an arm's length process. I think it's done very well. I think it's a very good organisation. I think arguably it could be used more than it is.
And given that you were the last New South Wales Premier during a recession, it's incumbent on me to ask you, what advice would you give the current New South Wales government, who has to deal with not only a recession, but obviously the current pandemic, and what's the pathway to recovery out of this recession in New South Wales?
If I knew that, I probably wouldn't be here, actually. But look, my first answer is, and it's a personal thing, and different leaders have different approaches. I think you've got to tell the public the truth. Now, part of the truth in the present situation is we don't know. And not only do I not know the answer to your question, but the reality is that governments don't know. So I think firstly, you've got to be open with people about the nature of the problem, the lack of previous history, so the uncertainty. And you say to people that we're going to do some trial and error. And some of the things we try may not work, but our purpose is to maximise employment and whatever our aims are. So I think politicians of all sorts tend to be a bit wary. I must say, and this is not a partisan comment, I think the Prime Minister has been good at, in this COVID thing, the reason he's generally got good polling results, is he's tended to be very open and down to earth. So that would be my first answer. I think my second answer would be, don't take no for an answer very easily if you're the government. In other words, if you want to increase the supply of social housing or whatever you might want to do, it was easy in the early weeks of COVID because everyone was scared and all the National Cabinet was working. It gets harder as it goes on, but I think you've got to take the same approach, which is the overriding thing is getting people back to work, is fixing the economy. Once we've got, who knows, we may have sort of reasonable stability in the next little while in Australia in terms of the health aspects. So, but I don't think there's an easy answer, and governments are better off if they say to people, we're doing all these things and they're not all going to work, and we'll keep changing them as we learn more about it.
And we touched on it a couple of times. Cooperative federalism has come under great scrutiny in the current climate, and Commonwealth-state relations have certainly attracted plenty of attention over the last 6 or so months. What do you think has worked very well over the last 6 months in terms of Commonwealth-state relations, and what hasn't worked so well?
What's worked is that, as I said an hour or so ago when we started, Ashley, I mean, this has presented a burning platform, and so people have been willing to accept the national medical, the expert advice. And I think that the formulation of the National Cabinet and the idea that you get one lot. I mean, there are more epidemiologists I discover around Australia than you could count in an hour, and they're all no doubt got some skills. But so what happened was that at least we got acceptance of expert opinion, which didn't mean the whole world accepted it, but it meant that all of the government's health bodies, at the end of the day, came together. And I think that question of experts, we've tended to stop accepting experts or relying on experts. Some people, the media, seem to think that's a good thing. I think it's actually a bad thing. I think we ought to have a system that helps expert opinion get implemented, and if it's wrong, well, you change. So I think that's worked well. I think what's happening is, the normal political blame game. I think it's an interesting thing that Australia now has 3, 4 or 5 inquiries into aspects of COVID, who was responsible for the Ruby Princess and who was responsible for the quarantine in Melbourne or whatever. I'm not at all sure that it's in the public interest for that to be happening in the midst of all this. Because what's happened is it then inevitably introduces politics is the enemy of progress in most cases. It's a matter of making the politics workable. And I think where politics has intruded, and that's clearly happened with border closures.
Yes.
I mean, you don't have to be an economist. I was one half a century ago. The notion that you just close all the borders is quite popular. I think in Queensland, Western Australia, I think probably polls show that people don't mind it. That doesn't make it the right thing in the interests of the nation, or even in the interests of the state, because of the economic impact, which then takes a longer period to unwind. So I think what's worked is where the normal federal argy-bargy, federal-state argy-bargy has been relegated or put out of mind. Then things work. When it comes back to the fore, you get the inevitable diversion of attention, which really doesn't help much, certainly not in the short term.
And what do you think will be the fertile areas for perhaps a revisitation of the respective powers of Commonwealth State? Now, we know historically the difficulty with referenda being successful and changing the Constitution, but are there other ways governments can work together in relation to implementing certain reforms through power sharing, tax sharing arrangements, not unlike the GST sharing arrangement that the former Prime Minister John Howard introduced in the late 90s?
Yeah, well, I was also, back before most of our listeners they were probably in school, Bob Hawke and I led something called the New Federalism, which had support from Wayne Goss in Queensland. Kevin Rudd was his chief of staff at that time, interestingly. Had all the support from Liberal and Labor and from the senior bureaucrats around the country. And things like the national electricity market came from that process, national standards for heavy vehicles and so on. Do I think that's worked as well as it should have? No. I think I once said at a press conference after one of these New Federalism meetings, we'd announced some great cooperative federalism thing, and I said, be careful, the empire will strike back. And of course, the empire has struck back. I think it was electricity at the time. There's been pressures. The interlinks between the states haven't happened as quickly as they should. We don't have as much of given it's 30 years, we don't have as much of a properly functioning electricity market as we might have had. But look, it remains. I think federalism remains one of the greatest areas for potential improvement. It also is. We have a state of origin mentality, I think, Ashley. So to some extent, it makes it harder here than in other places. But you can see in the US, you can see in their COVID treatment. I mean, not for me to talk about the US and the state governments, but you can see how difficult it's been them to have a national approach to COVID, given that they've got 50 or whatever state and territory health departments. So it's an area which I really hope over the next 10 years, and COVID may well help, the National Cabinet may well help, that you may get some improvement, and certainly in finance. And you mentioned the GST. We are now the only country in the world who've almost frozen the rate of our GST at a particular rate, and we've got a shrinking base, so we're heading down towards half of consumption. Now, that clearly was not the intention when 20 years ago when all this was being debated, and it isn't good for the country. Now, there are arguments about how do we compensate people who might suffer lower socioeconomic groups. Fine. But at the end of the day, the notion that we're not able as a country to have a consumption tax which can move, in other words, which is not frozen at a particular percentage or particular coverage. And the same applies to some of the state taxes that have been talked about now. I mean, stamp duties are at the top of everyone's list as a bad tax, because they essentially stop things from happening, stop people from moving to where there are jobs or moving to smaller houses when they don't need a big house. Stamp duties, obviously, residential stamp duties, obviously cry out for reform. Given that it's hard to make it a nobody lose, you do need to get all the treasurers together. And if you can get federal and state governments and both sides of politics together, and that's a big ask, I know, but it would certainly make it a lot better for the public. And the question really is, how do you best govern for our children? That, in a sense, is the question. And the answer is for the states, Liberal or Labor, to cooperate more, and for the federal government to encourage them to cooperate using whatever levers it might have.
And obviously there's been and there is currently a federal financial relations review that the Treasurer here in New South Wales announced in the 2019 budget, and there's a draft report coming out, and I expect in the current climate there will be increased attention on that issue. Now, just in the last few minutes, I just got two final questions, if I can, Nick. Knowing what you know now, if there was one reform you wish you had undertaken during your time as Premier, what would it have been and why?
Well, it's a hard question, excuse me. Not just because we've just been talking about it. If I had my druthers, I would have hoped, it wasn't just my decision, I would have hoped that new federalism would have worked more effectively. I think that is the greatest governance change you can make. That isn't just a sort of theoretical change, but would actually produce better results. So that would be, federalism would be my absolute, well, it was one of the things a lot of work was put into by both the Prime Minister and various state leaders. Then Prime Minister got left, and some of the leaders like me left, and Mr. Keating came in and he had a different view. And so and John Howard tried a bit, and certainly the idea of making GST a state tax was a very clever idea. But so that would be my answer. I think it's the area that is the hardest, but it cries out for change.
And last question, in the event that you and I were having this conversation in 10 years' time, in August 2030, what do you believe the public service of New South Wales would look like?
I think it will. I think some of the things, and I encourage people to have a look at the APS report because it does make sense. I think flexible, agile, I mean, all the things that if you walk down Martin Place in Sydney and said public service to people, what would their reactions be? They wouldn't be flexible, they wouldn't be agile, they wouldn't be speedy, etc. Now, those things are capable of change, both by political will and technology. And I think that's slowly, not quickly, but I think that will slowly happen. And I think the other thing is, and we didn't talk about it perhaps, I think people should be able to move in and out of the public service. It's been tried. I tried it, often not terribly successful. It would be a lot better if lawyers from Clayton Utz could work in the government and government lawyers could work at Clayton Utz. I mean, if there was more flexibility and openness between the public and private sectors, I would hope that I will see that in 10 years from now.
Thank you, Nick, and thank you very much for your time and your views and valuable insights from your time as Premier and in your stellar business career since. I am very grateful for your time, and I'm sure the audience is as well. That concludes our first live session in relation to the Government In-House Council Week, and I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you get the opportunity to watch a few other live sessions as well as our on-demand sessions. Thank you.